Hello again. My name is still Steve Flanders. I'm doing something a little different this time. I'm going to put this out right away, not schedule it, and kind of jump ahead a little bit, but everything will probably make sense as we go along. I'm needing to respond to Pope Leo's Encyclical, the Magnifica Humanitas, on safeguarding the human person in the time of artificial intelligence. I read it. It's pretty good. I kind of like it. I appreciate the fact that we've got an American Pope because he kind of speaks and writes American. I mean, there's a really good voice in it and some references to movies and everything, which I will take part in myself. There were some good ideas, but some wonderful ideas, actually. Talking about the common good, talking about dignity of people, talking about some things like the universal destination of goods, uh, solidarity, social justice, all of which my problem is those could be just code words for Marxism. And given the way that the Catholic Church has gone in the last 30, 40 years, it probably is. Another thing he mentioned in there that I hadn't read before was subsidiarity, which I think was defined as trying to make sure the government powers and decisions are made as close as practical to the local level so that people are most involved with their governance. And like a lot of things, I really agree with that. But so much of what goes on with these documents, it sounds really good, but I wonder if it just amounts to a good way for the men of the cloth, the bishops and such, to sit amongst the high rulers of the world and give moral cover to what they seem to be saying they're against. I think of, once I go right into a movie reference, V for Vendetta, which I've only watched a couple of hundred times. Father Linneman, who was a father at the time of all the crimes and later on was a bishop in the movie, was the highest paid guard in the prison camp. I mean, the highest paid person in the prison camp. And his job was to give moral cover to the crimes being committed. And often I'm wondering if that isn't what's going on, because while you have these wonderful ideas, they don't really have any specific proposals backing them up. And that's what I really want to respond to, is some specific proposals. Okay, first of all, in section 136 of the Encyclical, he talks about, for this reason, those who control digital platforms and means of communication have a considerable ability to affect the collective imagination and to present a particular vision of reality as desirable. Such power should be constantly guided by the pursuit of truth and respect for human dignity, so that the culture fostered on the internet does not become an instrument of excessive distraction, homogenization, or dominance, but rather a setting in which inner freedom and critical thought can mature. Well, yeah, I'm in favor of that too, but I'm in favor of doing more than sentiment. This goes into, I think it shows that there's really no border and boundary between artificial intelligence and the longer term issues we've had with social media. And I wrote an article, it's one of the blog posts, Taming Social Media. I'm going to put the address on the screen, about how we could get a handle on social media. Basically, there's a real problem with it in that, how are you going to do that without having the government get into dictating content? And I've given it a lot of thought, and I think there's some real good ways we can go about it. And it starts with recognizing the basic contract, the implied contract between individuals and these media companies, and it will definitely apply to AI, is that they will let us, use their media platforms, whether it's X or TikTok or Facebook or whatever. They provide us with the ability to be in contact with people, to find out things happening in the world, get advertised at a whole bunch more than we want. But what we bring to the table is our data, and that's the implied contract. I sign up, they start monitoring what I watch and everything. And okay, that's the way the game goes. That's, I watch a lot of free television and there's advertising. Well, I know there's advertising and they're watching, they're compiling this data on me. But that's where I think the government can step in and not control content, but kind of rebalance the relationship between the individual and these large corporations, because it's unbalanced as it is now. I mean, I'm sure it'll get worse with artificial intelligence, but with big media, big data, big social, there's shadow banning. It's like they don't like what you're saying. Nobody gets to really see it. There's no guarantee that everybody that you're friends with or everybody that follows you gets to see everything you put out. If you're putting out stuff they don't like, they just don't send it to people. Or X is famous for all of a sudden people that have 1 million followers suddenly don't have but 100,000 or whatever, right? And so the shadow banning, people get suspended, people get just absolutely taken off, and this is tremendously hurtful and unfair. You've got people that run businesses; they put hundreds of hours into compiling what is on their Facebook, say, account. And they're using it to present to the public and everything. And they get canceled, that's all taken from them. And so they're then starts presenting, I think, some of the ways the government can pass laws that will rebalance that kind of relationship, make it a two-way accountability. That, for one thing, I think whatever the community standards that Facebook and others are applying to people need to be published, need to be clear. And if somebody gets disciplined by these companies and they can show that we didn't violate your community standards, there needs to be some sort of redress through, lawsuit or something, but make that two-way accountability. So, first of all, having those, community standards and the terms of the contractual agreement clear and specified, not something, we've decided that doesn't meet our standards, and you ask why. Well, we don't really have to tell you. You just get to live with it. If you want to challenge it, we'll look at it, but we'll just hand you the decision. We're not still going to tell you why. We're just going to let you, be suspended for a time. And that's unfair. So that needs to be, you need to have clear and transparent terms of agreement. Okay? There's a number of other ways that we can and should balance these relationships. Empower the individual to be able to leave these sites. If you've ever tried to quit Facebook or some of the others, they can be hard to leave. Yeah, you can delete it off your phone or your computer, but it's still there. How do you just absolutely take it away so that that account is no longer there? You're no longer affiliated with that company. That's not easy. That should be easy. That should be your decision. It should be something that, it's on the home page. There's, a pull-down menu. You can select that. And there's maybe a two-step process. They need to confirm who you are. But then you're done. And not just done, but since the contract, the implied contract is they're providing these services because you're allowing them to get the data. When you leave, you should be able to take your data with you. That's what would really balance it, is if they have something to lose by you leaving, then their attitude would be a whole lot better toward the individual. It wouldn't have to be defined by the government. It can be just a relational definition between the individuals and the company. Okay, but not only can you leave, but your work should be savable and portable. If you put all this time and energy into putting together a website for your company, and Facebook decides that you should have used the right pronoun, or you shouldn't have said this, or you should have said that, and they're going to cancel your service. First of all, their terms of service need to state that, and you need to see clearly why they're doing it. But then when you say, okay, that's fine, I'm leaving, you should be able to save all your work and just plug it into some other social media network and reinvigorate your business that way. Have all the stuff you've done over the years saved and portable. Okay. In other words, the biggest thing to be done by government is to operate on the concept that our data, my data as an individual human being, is my personal property. I make agreements that people can have access to it, but once I've ended my relationship with that company, they don't have it anymore. And the way that could work is then they could test it. Once I have withdrawn from Facebook, and Facebook gets a request for data saying, how many men this age in this area like this, and this, and if my name shows up in the readout that they're selling to these companies to market, that's a violation. The day I withdraw, all my data has to be no longer accessible by those companies. If I've ended that relationship, it's ended both directions. I'm no longer getting their services. They no longer have access to my data. And I think that's a real good way to proceed as we go further into really, which is going to be just super social media sites with this AI. That's one of the reasons I'm hesitant to get involved. It's because I recognize AI can provide a lot of stuff and you can do a lot of things real fast. But think about the profiling information they can get on you by figuring out how you like to operate, what kind of stuff you want, how you want to design your art project or your writing, what corners you'll likely cut. The profiling, the personality profiling they can do with that is profound. But I think this approach to how to tame social media, and you can go to the site, to the post that's on my blog site. It's not part of the large book I've been talking about in 15 Minutes to Save America, but it's accessible, and I'll put the address will be there. Okay, the second point the Pope made in his encyclical was in section 159. Let me turn to that real quick, which is up here. It's important to go beyond the current metrics of development, which for more than 80 years have been tied to the concept of gross domestic product. Okay, I agree. We need to have a different way of measuring success in business, and that's precisely the benefit that I lay out in the series on corporate personhood. Let's see, there's 1, 2, 3. Episode 4 goes into the advantages of getting away from corporate personhood. And the basic concept there is you get away from corporate personhood and make it to where localities and states can once again regulate corporations. And it's not going to be, some sort of communist thing. It's not going to bring us into the state control and everything. It will instead make it to where corporations are much more accountable to communities. Instead of having an adversarial relationship between the owners and the workers and the people and the environmentalists, okay, we're going to sit at a round table where everybody's kind of equal. As a community, we're working on how to get this enterprise going successfully because it's going to benefit all of us. And in that environment, those new metrics about development and how to grow the economy will naturally come up. The new metrics, in other words, are not going to be a formula laid out by the government, okay, but rather a new relationship between the people and the corporations, making it to where it will actually be much healthier. What we have today is unhealthy because it is so adversarial. And by turning it into a much more cooperative, community-based dialogue, those new metrics about what's good for development and how to go about development will naturally arise. And I don't think, this blends into the larger point. I mean, going into, goes back to section 94, which, just a second, I will move my little screen to that, and it should go a little quicker because I have it marked. The danger of humanity becoming victim of its own achievements is already clearly recognized by St. Paul VI, who warned that the most extraordinary scientific progress, the most astounding technical feats, and the most amazing economic growth, unless accompanied by authentic moral and social progress, will in the long run go against man. Well, that's exactly right. And it's like, that's why, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm going to that's why I advocate for the open media, a true public forum. And one of the advantages that I go into in episode 19 episode 20, episode 19 lays out the bare bones of the open media. Episode 20, which will be released in a couple of weeks, goes into the advantages of having a true public forum. And I'd say the biggest advantage is that it will give us an ethical and moral patent office. Just as the patent office, which is enshrined in the Constitution of the United States, certainly worked to help develop new technology. It continues to work to help develop new technology. And good on it. I'm not against it. I don't think the Pope is against the development of new technology. But we are really lacking in the development of moral and ethical guidance and framework with which to deal with this technology. Having a true public forum is exactly what we need to deal with that. And that goes into, what 135 and 134 sections of the latest papal encyclical, where he touches on Hannah Arendt, even, talking about how, she's famous for quoting that it's not so much that the totalitarians want you to believe their lies, it's that they fill the public sphere, the public domain, with so much lying that people cannot discern the truth. And then they become susceptible to be led around by the nose by whoever controls the media. Well, that's exactly the problem. I think is well identified by the Pope in this. But once again, how do we get to where we have some sort of baseline of establishing the truth? And that's where I advance the open media, the public forum. Because with that, and I'll put the blog site up, and you can go directly to read the blog site, even though the episodes are not scheduled to air. The video series isn't scheduled to air for a couple of weeks. But the blog will talk about the open media amendment, and it talks about the advantages of it. Because it's with having no control on who gets to speak and letting the people as a whole get to determine where that dialogue goes, and where it goes from local to the winners locally go to the state, winners of the state go to the national. That's rough. There's a lot of details to be worked out, but that's roughly how it would work. We wouldn't necessarily establish quote unquote objective truth. How are we going to do that? But we would have a much more clear idea of what we as a people actually believe is true. And that's even that bare bones we're lacking these days. We can't trust the polls. We can't trust anything. So in this battle of truth against misinformation, which is getting to be a real problem with artificial intelligence, anybody that's watching anything realizes that in order to get to where we can have some semblance of truth, I certainly don't want some sort of government ministry of truth determining what's true and what isn't, and controlling the media that way. That's more dangerous than the confusion. And it's kind of a likely outcome of this confusion and why we want to deal with it in a better way, because people will eventually just succumb to it, some sort of ministry of truth. Better than that, let's have the way to deal with too much confusion in this Wild West kind of atmosphere in our media these days is don't try to stop that with by stifling freedom. The answer to the problems presented by freedom is actually more freedom and an orderly freedom. And I think that's the best we can do. And I think it will also help us to deal with all the other problems of our lack of ethical reasoning around our technical growth. So that's my response, to Pope Leo XIV, His Holiness Pope Leo. I don't use that term because I'm not Catholic, but I like the guy. Like I say, I rather liked the way he reasoned, and I appreciated some of his references, and I look forward to hearing more. But I think we need to go beyond just the general platitudes and sentiments, because I think that won't necessarily achieve any of the good that I think could be embodied in this encyclical, but it requires some solid policy, and some of the stuff I'm talking about here is exactly how we should go. Thanks for watching. Be sure and share.